Stress is where your brain believes that there's some really big important thing that you have to do. And so it flushes your system with glucose. That's what cortisol is. Cortisol is not a stress hormone. It's a hormone that gets glucose into your bloodstream fast because your brain's expecting that you have to do something.
Right. If you think of anxiety, I think the standard definition goes something like this feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease about something with an uncertain outcome. Worry can be a feeling where I'm feeling nervous, and it can also be a verb. I'm worrying. A feeling is different than an action.
I think that we can enhance our capacity to cope with stress because these neural circuits can be modified by experience. If you learn how to do that a few times, then when real life stress hits and kind of smacks you square in the face, you learn how to open up your gaze, realize where you are in time and in space, think for a second or more about what you're going to do and react adaptively. So you don't do stupid things that get you into trouble or that injure other people or yourself or get you thrown in jail or worse, dead.
I'm Doug Bopst, personal trainer, best-selling author, and entrepreneur, and I'm on a mission to help others become the best version of themselves. So I'd like to welcome you to the Adversity Advantage podcast, where we will help you use obstacles, failures, and setbacks to give you that edge needed for success. I'll be interviewing people from all walks of life on how they overcame trials and turned them into triumphs. So please sit back, relax, and get ready to be absolutely blown away by some of the wisdom and stories you're about to hear. Welcome back to another episode of the Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and today's episode is another masterclass and one that is also timely like the last one. But the topic of this discussion centers around mastering your response to stress and anxiety, which is something that we can all relate to. So today I have three of the top neuroscientists on the planet to help you better understand and manage your stress and anxiety. You will hear parts of three previously released episodes with Dr. Feldman Barrett, Dr. Jud Brewer, and Dr. Andrew Huberman. This first part will feature a section from my previous chat with Dr. Feldman Barrett. She stands among the top 1% most cited scientists globally for her revolutionary research in psychology and neuroscience. Her TED Talk on emotions has been viewed over 6 million times. In this section, she explains the science and evolution of your emotions and reactions, as well as how to change them. You will also learn the real function of the human brain and what stress actually is and why it scientifically leads to weight gain. Dr. Barrett will share how words affect our brain chemistry and how to change how you respond to anxiety and other struggles. So I hope you enjoy this part with me and Dr. Feldman Barrett. So from my understanding from your other interviews you've done in your books, and again, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but it just seems that when we go through life and situations and in moments, we get these things called feelings or moods or affects, I guess, in the more psychological scientific term. And then based on our childhood, our previous experiences and our memories, our body's first objective is to act, right? And we're taught, all right, I mean, I don't know if that's the right word, but we want to move towards whatever that is. And then we guess in our brain what's going on based on all of that and create our own emotional response to, am I correct?
Yeah, I think you're getting it pretty well. So what I would say is the first piece to understand is that your brains evolved to control bodies. That's why they evolved. They didn't evolve to be rational or anything like that. Of course, you don't experience yourself that way. But when you think, when you see things, when you hear things, when you feel something, all of that is really in your brain's, is in the service of your brain's most important task, which is to regulate the systems of your body. And that's what it's doing all the time, from morning until night, from birth till death. Okay. And when your brain is controlling your heart and controlling your lungs and like all the other gunk and junk that's going on inside your body is sending sense data back to your brain. So right now, you and I are sitting having a chat, but inside each of us, and actually inside each listener who's listening to this conversation, is a whole drama going on that you are largely unaware of, thank goodness. Because if you were aware of it, you would never pay attention to anything outside your own skin ever again. And if you don't believe me, go to one of those flotation tanks, like those sensory deprivation tanks where you float in salt water, because they block out, they make it dark and they put in earplugs and you take off all your clothes and you get into this pool, which is at the same temperature as your body, as your skin. And basically, they've made it so there's no external sensations coming from the world at all. And then all of a sudden, you just are exposed to this real symphony of stuff going on inside, which normally is just drowned out. Largely right now, it's happening right now. You just can't sense it. And so evolution has kind of given us a workaround to figure out like when everything is copacetic, or like is everything okay inside my body, or are things kind of out of balance? And that's what you called affect or mood or feeling. And these simple feelings, do you feel comfortable or uncomfortable? Do you feel good or bad? Do you feel really worked up or really calm? These feelings are always with us all the time. They sometimes, when they're really intense, they're like right in the foreground of what we're experiencing. Sometimes they're in the background of what we experience, like when someone cuts you off on the highway. That is when we used to drive before COVID.
Yeah.
When someone cuts me off on the highway, my immediate reaction is, what an asshole.
Right.
So that's affect, that's feeling, but I'm embedding that feeling in the perception of that guy as an asshole, as opposed to my reaction to that guy. So affect is always there. What we do with it kind of changes, but it's always there. Affect is not emotion, right? Affect doesn't tell you what is wrong. It just tells you something is wrong. It doesn't tell you what is okay. It just tells you something's okay. And then you have to figure out, what do I need to do now? And so what your brain is always doing is it's guessing. The way that we describe it is your brain is trapped in a box called your skull. It's receiving information from your body and from the world, right? Like a tug in your chest or a bang in the air. And your brain, these are the effects, the causes, the outcomes of something that just happened, but your brain has to guess at what the causes are. And so it's using your past experience that come from your lived experience of a whole lifetime, and also the things that you've watched on TV and that you've read and that you've heard from other people. And all of this is available in your brain to try and make sense of what that tug means or what that bang means. And so your brain is always making a guess. And the guess that it makes is action first and experience second, which I know sounds nuts, but that actually is the way it's working. So when your brain makes a guess about what that bang is or what that tug is, that guess is first a preparation to act. And then it's, well, the last time I prepared myself to act this way, what did I see? What did I hear? What did I feel? That's sort of how it works.
So talk about how somebody can really go from maybe when they get these affects based on their patterning and the way they grew up, they're responding, their brain is guessing fear, anger, rage, whatever it is. How can they start to maybe train their brain over time? Because I know it's not easy. It's extremely hard at first to respond more efficiently and positively.
I would say it's one of the most difficult things to do. And you can't actually do it unless you a little bit how it works. But even when you know how it works, it doesn't exactly make it easier.
Right.
And I would say I've been at this for 30 years and I still think it's hard sometimes. It's still really, really hard sometimes. And so I want to back up one step and talk about, just start where you started, and then I'm going to answer your question. So I want to take one step back and say, when a baby is born, that baby's brain is born under construction. The baby can't regulate its own body. Baby can't even burp by itself, can't feed itself, can't do very much, can't even control its limbs. Okay. I remember the day that I watched my daughter for the first time try to swing at something deliberately. She missed it by like a mile, but I could see she was looking right at it and she was trying to get her arm to hit it, but she completely missed it. Right. So you can't even move your limbs by yourself. So your caregivers are basically maintaining your nervous system for you. They're feeding you and they're keeping your temperature regulated and they're teaching you when to go to sleep and all of these things. So the way I describe it is your brain is running a budget for your body. It's not budgeting money. It's budgeting glucose and salt and water and so on. And everything that you do, everything that you learn, every compliment you give, every insult you bear, every hug you share, all of these things are, you can think of in terms of deposits and withdrawals from your budget, right? So when you exercise, that's a withdrawal, but it's an investment. You're spending because you expect to get some return on your investment.
Right.
So a baby's brain can't run its own body budget. That's what its caregivers do. Its caregivers keep that body budget solvent. And in the process, the baby's brain is being wired to a particular world, a world that is curated by the parents, by what the parents do, how often the parents talk to the baby, what they say to the baby, and so on and so forth. And that goes on through childhood and into adolescence. And it takes about 25 years until a brain is developed to its adult state in a human. And even then, we're still making deposits and withdrawals metaphorically in each other's body budgets all the time. Okay. So remember how I said when your brain is receiving these sense data and it's asking itself, like it's trying to use past experience to make sense. Really what your brain is doing is figuratively asking itself, not what is this bang or what is this tug? It's what is this like? What is this similar to in my past experience? So because of how our brains work, they're very, very dependent on the past experiences that you have. The past is used to cultivate, to make predictions about the future, which become your present.
Right.
And so what that means, though, is if you make a big deposit, if you make a big withdrawal, I should say, as an investment to cultivate a new present, that present in a minute from now will be the past. There are a lot of different things that you can practice that are like investments. You're using energy, but it's an investment. And what you're doing is you're cultivating your past to control who you will be in the future, basically. So changing your experience right now in the heat of the moment is super hard.
Yeah.
It's doable. But it's really, really hard. But what you can do is you can practice when you're not in the heat of the moment. And then if you practice, like any skill, if you practice it enough, you start to do it automatically. So here's an example. Every day I practice for 5 minutes, I practice an experience of wonder or awe because it gives my nervous system a break. And even when I don't need it, like today, for example, I have a friend who lives in New Zealand and she sent me a little videotape of a beach. She's at the beach and she sent me a little videotape of the shore and the ocean because she knows I love the ocean. And I haven't been able to go to an ocean since last March when the pandemic hit. And so I can take that and I can use that for 5 minutes, cultivate an experience of awe. But I can also cultivate an experience of awe by looking at a dandelion poking through a broken sidewalk and be in wonder at the majesty of nature that will not be constrained by human activity, no matter what we do. We pave over it with concrete and still nature pokes its way through. You can practice gratitude, you can practice compassion. It may seem like a waste of time and energy to you, except when you're feeling really stressed, really pressed, your brain can pull out those experiences and give your nervous system a break.
But one of the things that really blew me away as a trainer in your book was when you talked about, like, you hear a lot in my field, if you're stressed, you can gain weight. If you're stressed, you might gain some fat in your midsection. But when I read that you had came across these studies, and I don't remember the exact statistics, but that when someone was stressed out, that when within 2 hours of them eating, it added like an additional 100 calories or so to whatever food they were eating. And if they were in some sort of stressful environment, and I don't remember the exact timing of this one, that when you ate a healthy fat, it got digested as French fries.
So I think it's really important that people understand that a couple of things. One is that what is stress? Stress is where your brain believes that there's some really big important thing that you have to do. And so it flushes your system with glucose. That's what cortisol is. Cortisol is not a stress hormone. It's a hormone that gets glucose into your bloodstream fast because your brain's expecting that you have to do something.
Right.
So imagine that your brain believes that you have to lift 100 pounds. Every time you walk into a room with your parents who are arguing, it's like your brain believes something to the equivalent of you have to lift 100 pounds. And you don't lift 100 pounds, right? So it prepares you for nothing. Well, eventually, each time that happens, you pay a little metabolic tax. Not a big tax, but like a little one. But eventually, those little taxes add up. It's just like if a drip keeps dripping on a metal pipe, eventually it will bore a hole through that pipe, right? It doesn't happen the first time, doesn't happen the 1,000th time, but eventually that pipe is going to be destroyed. It's exactly the same kind of thing. You're paying a little bit of metabolic tax. What does that metabolic tax cost? About 104 calories. That's what we learned, right? That when you are stressed within a 2-hour period of eating, it's like just adding 104 calories to your meal, which if you add that up over a year is 11 pounds. 11 pounds, right? And similarly, if you are stressed within a day, it means that any of the good fats that you eat are metabolized as bad fats. So basically, our feelings actually are very tied to our metabolism, but we don't understand that in our everyday life. So you could be eating exactly the same thing as your friends who are less stressed, and you will gain more weight because your body is metabolizing things slightly less efficiently. When bad things happen to you, you're victimized twice, really. The first time you're victimized because something bad happens to you.
Right.
It's not your fault, right? But then you're left to clean up all the crap, and only you can do it. Not because it's your fault or you're culpable, but because you really are the only one with the power to do it. And that feels unfair, and it is unfair, but it's also life.
Yeah.
And luckily, there are skills that you can learn to do it. And it's not easy, but it is effective if you stick with it over time. And you have to really realize that feeling bad doesn't mean that something's wrong. Just like exercise, right? I mean, what Marines say, pain is weakness leaving the body. This is something my coach tells me like on a regular basis as I start to bitch and moan when he wants me to add 10 pounds to something. And I'm like complaining about it. He reminds me of this. And it's really true in life as well. So whenever you're doing something really expensive, really hard and metabolically expensive, it is not going to feel good necessarily. And that can mean exercise, and it can mean learning something new, whether you're talking to somebody who's on the opposite side of a political spectrum from you, or whether it's learning the piano, or whether it's learning a new language. There are always going to be times when things don't feel good, but sometimes something not feeling good means that you're doing something really hard, but that it could be a really good investment for your future.
And I think one thing that I've heard you say that I totally agree with that it comes down to is you really have to choose your heart, right? Because, I've heard you say that it is somebody's responsibility and they need to take ownership of them changing. And if they don't want to, it doesn't make them a quote unquote, I heard you say snowflake or a bad person. We shouldn't shame those people, but they also need to know, and I would need to know if it was me, that my life is still going to be hard. My relationships are going to be challenging. I'm going to be paying more in healthcare costs. My job productivity might not be good. I'm going to have mental health issues. Like that's all hard stuff to go through. And then on the other side of it, the hard is getting into a workout routine maybe that I haven't done, drinking more water, getting better sleep, practicing meditation, surrounding myself with better people. All that stuff is challenging too. And it's like, well, which one do you want? Do you want the one that's pretty much guaranteed for you to be miserable in life? Like it's guaranteed pretty much. Or do you want the one that it's not going to always be great? Like life isn't always great, but you're going to learn a lot along the way. You're going to have a smile on your face. You're going to be more productive. You're going to have some wisdom.
Exactly. That's exactly right. It's exactly right. I think in a little bit, I would say in the United States, there's like a tyranny of happiness. Like you think that they should be entertained and happy. And I really think that being satisfied and living a meaningful life is not the same as being carefree and happy in every moment. And of course, we all want to feel, I think really what people want to feel is comfortable, meaning not in pain. Like They don't want to suffer. And it is possible to have a life where you minimize the amount of suffering that you do, but you have to do it by taking responsibility for yourself and for other people. So we don't just manage our own body budgets. We also, figuratively speaking, make deposits and withdrawals into other people's body budgets. We regulate each other's nervous systems in many ways that other animals do too. But we have an additional way, and that's with words. I guess I would just say this. If you look in the brain, you look at the systems that are involved in understanding language and generating spoken language, they're exactly the same as the regions that are controlling your body. I can text 3 little words to a close friend of mine who lives, halfway around the world. She doesn't have to see my face or hear my voice. She can just see those words, and I can change her metabolism, her breathing, her heart rate. I mean, we do this all the time in experiments with people in the lab, but we also do it with each other. And so what this means is that a kind word can do a lot for someone, and an insult can also have an impact. And so we have this kind of situation where we have these socially dependent nervous systems where we're influencing each other's body budgets, and therefore the likelihood that we're influencing each other's well-being in the moment in really profound ways.
And I think the one thing that you talked about in the book a lot, or not a lot about, but one of the things that really hit home with me was the thing on anxiety and how to change your perception when you have anxious feelings. And I think words don't just have, at least in my opinion, I could be completely wrong, don't just have an effect on others, they have an effect on ourselves when we talk to ourselves. And if you are waking up in the morning and you get into this panic and you have it, I know you talk about in the book, like it's a test and you are like panicking, you're like, oh my God, I have anxiety. I'm so nervous. I'm so nervous. I'm so nervous. You're going to go down this rabbit hole and develop these emotions attached around fear and anxiety based on your brain guessing in response to these affects, right?
Yes.
But if you change, it seems like the way you talk to yourself and say, I'm really excited about this test. I'm going to do great. I'm determined to pass. I'm going to do whatever I can. I think over time, correct me if I'm wrong, if this is repeated over a certain amount of times, your default won't be anxiety. Your default will be, I'm excited and determined. Am I right?
Absolutely. So there is research which shows that, I'm going to flip around what I'm going to say because I want people to really understand what I'm saying. If you are clinically depressed, clinical depression is like a bankrupt body budget, really.
Right.
Like the 2 most expensive things your brain can do is move your body and learn something new. And so what do you do when you're running a deficit in your actual bank account? You stop spending. So that's what your brain does too. And it means that you get fatigued and you don't want to move too much. And it also means that you stop learning and you just stick with what's in your head and you don't pay attention too much about what's out in the world. And if you do, you're interpreting it in line with what's in your head. And so you can't take advantage of the positive things around you, because that's not how you're feeling. You're running a deficit. And so when you're at the point of a clinical depression, you can't just use these, strategies and expect to dig yourself out of it. You need usually a little bit of help. Ditto for post-traumatic stress disorder or any kind of serious anxiety disorder. So what I'm talking about works well before you get to that point or as you're coming out of that point.
Got it.
Okay. So for example, if you're depressed, and you're starting to recover from depression, it means that your brain is sort of not locked into this negative body budget anymore. And so it's starting to pay more attention to what's going on around you in the world, and it's going to try to predict. And when your brain has trouble predicting, there's an increase in some chemicals that will make you feel jittery and worked up. So actually, if you start to have anxiety symptoms, that is, you start to feel jittery after you're recovering from depression, that's actually probably a good sign, because it means that your brain is not locked down anymore into this like really, really deficit kind of situation. So feeling jittery isn't anxiety, it's feeling jittery.
Right.
And you can feel jittery because you had too much coffee. You can feel jittery because your brain is preparing you to do something super hard. And so you're really pumped, which is determination. Before my TED Talk, I could feel my heart beating in the tips of my fingers. I mean, I was And if my brain had made sense of those sensations as anxiety, that would guide my actions. I would have done something very different than if I constructed determination. And what I found really interesting about it is that's what I was going out to talk about on stage, right? But
Ironic.
what I was there telling myself was, get your butterflies flying in formation. Get your butterflies flying in formation. Yeah, sure, you're about to step out in front of 1,000 people and deliver this speech, which you've memorized, maybe. So there is research to show that you can train people to make determination out of this jittery jumble of feelings instead of making anxiety. And remember how I said, when your brain makes a prediction, it's making a guess at the causes of sensation. The first thing that guess is about is an action. So if you construct anxiety out of your jittery feelings, that's going to lead you to act in different ways than if you construct determination. And similarly, if let's say you are starting to run a deficit in your body budget and you wake up in the morning and you feel like you can barely drag yourself out of bed, you can start to construct sadness and weariness out of that feeling. It's easy for most of us because there's enough going on that's going wrong with that we can easily do that. But it's also possible just to construct a feeling of an imbalanced body budget, right? So this morning I woke up and I was exhausted. And I didn't tell myself I'm worried about this, that, or the other thing. I didn't tell myself, well, I'm feeling sad over the loss of this, that, or the other thing. I told myself, I probably didn't get enough sleep. I probably need to be really careful today. Today is a day where I'm going to want to eat all the time because I'm tired, and I'm going to construct hunger out of that in the hopes that it will kind of perk me up. But that's not going to work, right? What I have to do today is make sure that I get up every hour and take a walk. I have to make sure that I'm hydrated. I have to make sure maybe I'm going to drink a little extra tea. So I'm going to borrow some energy from tomorrow to get me through today. But really what I'm suffering from is a momentary deficit. Maybe not momentary, because we're all surfing the tsunami of stress of this,
right.
of this, yeah. But the kinds of things that I'll do, maybe I'll walk into my husband's office and ask for a hug, or maybe I'll say to my daughter, be nice to me today because I don't have the spoons for a lot. But basically, the way that you make sense of the sensations in your body and the feelings that come from those has a direct relation to the actions that you take. And that will set you down the path of maintaining a bad feeling and even making it worse, or maybe nudging yourself in the direction of feeling a little better.
And I think a lot of times people aren't even aware that they're even stressed out. They think they're sick or something else. I mean, have you experienced that in your research?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And in fact, my daughter came up with this really great concept, which she calls the emotional flu. The emotional flu means I feel like shit. And I want you to know that I feel like shit.
Yeah.
I want sympathy from you. I want empathy because I feel bad. But I know I'm not depressed. I know I'm not anxious. I know nothing's wrong really, except that my body budget is kind of, running a deficit at the moment. But I'm feeling bad, and I want you to know that. So when she says to me, I say, how are you? And she's like, oh, I'm having a moment of the emotional flu. I know what that means. That means she needs a hug. And when she was a little girl, we used to call that a visit from the Krabby Fairy. Like, oh, the Krabby Fairy is visiting you. I mean, in every person's life, if you look hard enough, you can find something that's wrong. And you can attach your feelings and your physical state to that thing. But that's weaving together a story that will take your brain down a particular path. And you have a choice. There are other stories with other paths that you can nudge yourself along. And that sounds like a lot of effort. And sometimes it is, but not always. If you practice on a regular basis doing this, then you do get kind of automatic about it. And I think the most important thing to realize is that variation is the norm. Variation is the norm, even for you, which means on some days, in some moments, you will do better than on other moments and other days. And so you just have to have some compassion for yourself. And when you go to sleep, you have to remember tomorrow is another day.
Yeah, and it seems like in simple terms, you hear the words like neuroplasticity and plasticity and rewiring thrown around a lot these days. And I think in the simplest form, it just means trying to make conscious decisions that sometimes are hard to change the way your present is and the way your future will be. And it seems it all comes down to managing things like dopamine, your serotonin, which it seems like they don't control everything in the brain, but I think they play, it seems, very many parts, right?
Doug, though, serotonin, dopamine, oxytocin, opioids are all metabolic regulators. So we refer to them as for other functions, but they evolved to regulate your metabolism. And that is what they are doing. So as serotonin is mucking about with your mood, it is regulating your metabolism. And that is why it has those mood effects. Wow. So I think the thing to remember is that your mind and your body are not linked in some gauzy, new agey kind of way. They are linked in a very, very real biological way. Whenever you have a change in your feelings or in your thoughts, there's some change going on under the hood. And when it comes to plasticity, I think it's important to remember that your brain is a use it or lose it kind of organ. So plasticity doesn't mean you get yourself on a pot thinking more flexibly and then you can stop. Then it stops being hard and you can just, your brain is finally able to have some choice over the narrative it's telling, the way that it's predicting, the meaning that it's making. And then that's it. You just did it. And it's like exercise. If you don't work that muscle, you're going to lose that muscle memory and you're going to, eventually the muscle will atrophy. And it's exactly the same as your brain. So the way your brain works. So you're constantly making, investments in having a flexible brain in order to have a healthy mind.
I know there's science out there about gratitude and having perspective on things that you do have in your life instead of constantly focusing on the things that you don't, correct?
Yeah, yes, there is. This will be the last thing that I'll say and then we'll wrap up. I'm a really skeptical person. I'm skeptical about my own work. It took me 25 years before I was even willing to consider writing a book. When I first got a hold of that literature on gratitude, I just didn't believe it. I was like, there's no way that this works. I just do not believe it. I do not believe it. But then the thing is, the research kept mounting up and mounting up and mounting up. And then I actually started to try it. And I thought, actually, there really is something to this. There really is something to this. And that's the thing, right? Is that any given experiment that you run and you publish has flaws. But when all different experiments that have all different flaws keep finding the same thing over and over and over, it means that there probably really is something to it. And on some days, Doug, when things feel like a real struggle, I just remind myself that I'm really lucky to have that struggle. And I'm not a Pollyanna. And that's really not my attitude towards the world. But I do think that everybody has a choice. Some people have more choices over their lives than other people due to circumstances, but everybody has a choice about something. No one can control everything, and some people can control more things than others, but everybody can control something. And that is the path to a more fulfilling life.
So I hope you enjoy the first part of the episode with me and Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett. And in this next section, you will hear from Dr. Andrew Huberman. Dr. Huberman is a neuroscientist and tenured professor of neurobiology and ophthalmology at the Stanford University School of Medicine. He is also the host of the highly popular podcast, the Huberman Lab Podcast. In this section, we take a deep dive into the neuroscience of the different reward systems of the brain and how they function and how they relate to addiction. We also chat about cell phone addiction and the dangers of excessive screen time. You will also learn in depth about the stress response, how to use stress to your advantage, as well as science-backed tools to help you decrease stress immediately. So hopefully you enjoy this next part with me and Dr. Andrew Huberman.
What do drugs and things like anger and violence, what do they do to the brain? And after you use them, do they have long-term effects to the point where you're not able to rewire them through neuroplasticity, or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a great question. So at the root of most all mischief and self-destruction is dopamine. Now, I don't want to give dopamine a bad rap because at the root of all of human evolution and progression is dopamine. But when you take your story or my story and you say, well, what's the common theme? Again, this is the idea, like, what are the common principles? It's that a young person with a hunger for something, for novelty, that gets bored easily, that wants something to happen, that wants excitement, you're seeking dopamine. And I think it's a beautiful thing when a young child and an adolescent and a teen can learn to achieve those dopamine hits, or whatever you want to call them, through healthy activities, through things that serve them well and promote wellness, right? I mean, there's everything good about, running on the cross country team, or, jogging a couple miles a few times a week. That's great. And the endorphin and dopamine release that you experience from that is wonderful and healthy and serves to reinforce those behaviors. Everything I described and some of the things that you've described in your story are about chasing dopamine and trying to find that. We need it. It's a non-negotiable. And the question is, are you going to get it through things that are healthy and that build your life, or that send your life down the path of challenge and destruction? You asked whether or not you can rewire these circuits. Well,
so wait, why do we need dopamine? Is it just because it's like to keep our energy systems going throughout the day?
So dopamine is normally associated with the feeling of reward, and it does make us feel good. But dopamine is what keeps us motivated toward a goal, toward reward. So if an animal, remember, these systems exist in dogs and in cats and in birds and elephants, for that matter. This chemical was designed to put animals, including humans, on a path to something and to pursue things outside our own immediate reach. They are the opposite of the chemicals that make us feel good with everything that we've got in our immediate space, like serotonin and the opioid system. And we can talk about those. So dopamine was designed to motivate us. Think about dopamine more or less as a jet engine that propels you in a certain direction. And then when you get to where you want to go, you get replenishment of that dopamine. That's essentially the way dopamine works. It's the reason why thirsty animals and humans get up and move toward the sink. It's the reason that if you're food deprived, you seek food. It's the reason why if you want more resources to secure a better life, you focus on the external and figure out how this organism that has a container, your skin, is going to move through the environment to get to that thing, that reward and that build. And so human evolution is largely the consequence of the action of dopamine. Solving a puzzle for a scientist, discovering something, that is a massive dopamine rush. And dopamine can be released in small amounts or big amounts. The genetic thing that you asked about is interesting. There is this idea that some people have a greater propensity for sensation seeking and novelty seeking. I would say that most people it's on a continuum, but that most people have pretty healthy levels of dopamine transmission. But early in development, the things that you experience that really kind of wake you up and thrill you, the excitement about a song that you hear when you're 15 will forever be embedded in you. And that's that relationship between dopamine and plasticity. So not only is dopamine motivating you and driving you towards rewards, but dopamine is involved in queuing up the brain and nervous system's ability to change. So you want more of the thing that gave you that. And if you think about it from an evolutionary perspective, it's so logical. Let's say you're a thirsty animal and you find the stream that gives you water. Dopamine doesn't reinforce your relationship to the stream. It does that, but it mostly reinforces the walking and the pursuit that got you to the stream. And so when you think about replace stream with a drug of abuse like cocaine, and at first it's about the feeling of getting cocaine, but they've looked very carefully at what happens in the brain when people are anticipating drugs. And that's where you get the surge of dopamine that gets you out there doing what you need to do in order to secure that drug. And for some people it's drugs. Like I said, I was fortunate that wasn't the way I was wired. I eventually, I think, replaced some of it with exercise. For me, exercise is a non-negotiable. I'm not maniacal about it, but I need my 4 or 5 workouts a week, it's pleasure for me when people are like, oh, I have to work out. I'm like, oh my goodness, if I could recover, I'll work out again. I'm jealous of people that can train twice a day and still recover. I can't. I don't have those kind of recovery abilities. But, whether or not it's drugs or it's food or it's water or it's sex, think about it. The propagation of our species, the reproduction of our species, and the continuation of our species is the most important aspect of our biology in every species. Okay. So obviously sex needs to be age appropriate and consensual, all of that. But the important thing to understand is that the dopamine system was wired into the pursuit of mates for this very reason, because Mother Nature needed to install a mechanism in us that would universally drive us towards the things that would allow us to reproduce and to continue, whether or not it's water, food, sex, warmth, shelter, social connection. You can't overstate the power of dopamine. We have other reward systems in the brain. So there's also a serotonin system in the brain and an oxytocin system in the brain. And those are very rewarding too. They make us feel kind of blissful, less, if we were going to use the kid, like the kids say, like, are you like really psyched and hyped and like keyed up? That would be dopamine. Blissful and blissed out, that's more serotonin and oxytocin. Okay. So, and probably nowadays there's language that I just don't know because I'm 45 years old. So forgive me to the younger audiences if there's a different language around all that. But oxytocin and serotonin are feel-good molecules that tend to promote a sense of stillness or a desire to remain still. They are what are released when you eat a good meal. They're what's released post-orgasm in sex to encourage both parties of that mating event to stay still, to exchange pheromones so that there's a pair bond is established. And the pair bond is very diabolical and very beautiful. I say diabolical because it's arranged, it's prearranged subconsciously so that you will hopefully build the kind of bonds that will allow you to raise children together. That is the basis of that neurochemistry. Now, we know this because there are species of animals that are monogamous and other members of the same species that are not. And the extent to which oxytocin and another molecule called vasopressin are released depends on whether or not they're monogamous or not. But remember, these chemicals were designed to bias our behavior toward action or stillness. So the thing about dopamine that's really beautiful, but also can be quite sinister, is that dopamine wants more dopamine. Dopamine puts you in action. Dopamine, you talk to a drug user and they might, if it's a drug like heroin, it creates a sense of quiescence and like stillness. I mean, the opioid system is the ultimate form of stillness, right? It creates this kind of state in which people don't want to go out and do anything else until they need more. The dopamine system, so amphetamines and cocaine, unfortunately tend to put people on the path to more. As soon as they get it, they're thinking about more. And when you look into the world of process addictions, things like sex addiction and food addictions, because it's a little complicated what constitutes an addiction when you start getting into behavioral addictions, but they do exist. What you find is people will report the same thing, that they're seeking sex or food and then they get it, and that's not even the reward for them anymore. They're more into the seeking than the actual reward. And that's when you start to look at things like online apps and dating apps and things. You start to say, wow, like we are really being leveraged. We need to be conscious of what's happening here. So there are these two reward systems. One makes us kind of still, the serotonin oxytocin system. The other one is designed to put us into modes of more pursuit. And the opioid system, I feel obligated to just mention, because we talked about it briefly, like heroin and the opioids, those were designed to be triggered in our body. Their release happens naturally in our body, but at very low levels. They were basically designed as Mother Nature's painkillers. So that if you and I have to walk 100 miles together to go to a new village or do something or to find something, and I've got a blister and my ankle's hurting and my knee is hurting, the opioid system can kick in and provide some pain relief. But it was never designed to be released in the massive quantities that things like OxyContin and other drugs do for so many people. And again, I don't hate the pharmaceutical industry or the biotechnology industry, quite the opposite. But I think we have to understand the tremendously large amount that's released when people take those things as opposed to when they do natural behaviors.
So I want to get into, that was awesome, about all the insight you just provided on how drugs like impact our neurochemistry and dopamine and everything. The one drug I think that you're very passionate about that it goes under the radar, I think, is our cell phones. And we're seeing now that during this pandemic, and even as the rise of technology is that's being used for business, being used for connection, everything else, we're seeing more people on their phones. How have you seen like people who are addicted to their phones? How is it impacting their brains?
So I think it's important, if we're going to talk about addiction, that we define what addiction is. So I define addiction as a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure or bring someone pleasure.
Right.
And I think it's important to define it that way because the biology supports that definition. The difference between somebody who has a glass of wine or two a couple nights a week and somebody who's a alcoholic is the alcoholic really doesn't care for much else besides alcohol after some point. Or they are unable to engage or care for much else without alcohol being there first. So I think it's important to understand that it's almost like the dopamine circuits become overtaken by this singular drive or the singular stimulus. Now, people can be addicted to multiple things, but in general, that definition, I think, works. The other thing that I think is important for us to understand, especially when we're going to talk about cell phone addiction, is that addictions lower the baseline on our life, right? A heroin user doesn't need to use much heroin for the first time before their relationships and their job and their health is going to suffer. I can get addicted to water, but I have to drink a lot of water before my relationships, my health, and my profession starts to suffer. I could do it, but they are far and away different molecules in terms of how they're impacting the nervous system. And so I think it's important to understand where cell phones fit into that. Phones obviously have an enormous utility. They save lives in many ways, right? First responders need them. I communicate with my lab with them. Physicians use them. I mean, they're absolutely crucial devices for modern living. But there is a way in which they start to take a significant amount of our time and start to impede our ability to experience pleasure with other things if we're away from our phones for too long. So there's definitely an anxiety associated with being away from the phone. Some of that's meaningful. Parents want to know where their kids are. Spouses want to know where they're be able to communicate with their spouse, this kind of thing. But I think that it's not just the likes that you get on social media. It's really the fact that so much of the content in the phone is now being curated to your specific desires and what you want and what you're seeking and purchasing. In fact, your phone and the AI in your phone knows you better than you do. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is that not only knows you better than you do, but it knows to deliver certain things at certain times of day and at particular rates. And it actually has mapped your behavior to the point where it knows where you're foraging and when, so it can start to predict your behavior probably even better than you can. And so I don't think phones are evil. Look, I grew up in Silicon Valley area. I live here now. I don't think they're evil. I think they're absolutely indispensable for modern living. But I think that there's a misconception. The misconception is that you make your money or your living on social media, or that if you don't communicate something on social media or through a phone, it didn't happen. If you don't send a photo, something via text, etc. When in fact, if you look at people who are very successful in life, you find that most of that success is achieved away from, certainly from the phone and from screens of most sort. And unless maybe they're a writer or they're developing, they're like stitching music and doing this kind of thing or creating music. So the laptop is a tool for creation. The phone is a tool for communication mainly. And in general, if you want to be successful in life, you need to have some discipline around the phone. I have found that the phone is increasingly invading my life. There've been a couple studies showing that more often than not, when people are watching a movie, they're also watching, they've got another screen in front of them too. So they've got phone and tablet or phone and computer. So we're starting to stack screens now. And I do an experiment every once in a while where I just lock my phone in a safe to write or to run. And, I'd almost forgotten what it was to be away from it. So I think it does leverage these dopamine circuits. I think that we were talking about earlier. I think it also leverages some of those serotonin circuits, the ones that make you feel good, because frankly, it's nice when you land in a new city and you've been traveling and you go to your hotel and you plop down on the bed and you open your phone and you can have a conversation with somebody. So it's not all bad, but I think we need to pay careful attention to the baselines in our life and be cautious about that. And I'll say one more thing about the phones, which is it is a small box. And when you're bringing your visual attention to a very narrow point of focus throughout the day and repeatedly, you are exhausting your neural circuits and your capacity for focus. And you only get so much of that to spend, so to speak, each day. And so if you're somebody who is thinking about creative projects, building a podcast, writing a book, studying for exams, building a career of any kind, or embellishing or building relationships, every time you're absorbed into your phone for a couple hours or 20 minutes or so, you're spending out powers of attention that can be, if you feel appropriate, can be spent on other things. So you can't do it all. You can't look at your phone all day and do all those other things. You really need to understand that some of the ADD that we hear people talking about, like, oh, I have ADD. I think people have given themselves a bit of ADD. The attentional circuits in the brain that involve things like acetylcholine and norepinephrine, those are learning to pursue things inside that little box that you call your phone and I call my phone. And the brain is a learning machine. You do it enough, the last 10 years, there've been a lot of smartphones from about 2010 on. You do that for 10 years, your brain is reshaped and you can shape it back again, but it takes some significant work.
And I know you talk a lot about the growth mindset and how going through hard times of adversity can actually become something positive and how it can really cultivate some motivation and momentum from all of that. So like, how do you think that adversity and going through hard times impacts the brain from a neurological standpoint, neurochemical standpoint, and how can we respond to that fight or flight response? Because typically when we hit adversity, we hit fight or flight in a way that's conducive to a growth mindset.
Yeah. So I think that, I wouldn't wish trauma and hardship on anybody, but I think that certainly in my case, having an early experience or set of early experiences where there was a lot of adrenaline in my system. And I'm not talking about the good kind. I'm talking about the scared kind. I don't know what's going to happen here. Loss of control around me, really feeling destabilized is really the reflection of having a lot of adrenaline in your system and learning to be comfortable with that. I mean, I think I learned a lot from martial arts where you're getting hit, you're getting hurt. Again, I don't recommend people run out and do anything that gives them head damage because that has long-term effects too. But, I definitely sparred my share of rounds and you learn how to anchor your thinking and stay clear and maintain control when you have a lot of adrenaline in your system. And trauma is terrible, obviously, but trauma is the test that many young people, unfortunately, and adults get in terms of how well they can manage themselves and their nervous system when they have all this adrenaline and norepinephrine in their system. Those are the same molecule, actually. Norepinephrine and adrenaline, just to remind people, is released extremely fast and makes you feel very agitated and makes you feel like you want to say and do all sorts of things. And that's because its main goal is to put you into a mode of action and responsivity, not into a mode of relaxation. And so I think some people learn through sports to have high levels of adrenaline in their system and learn how to regulate their thinking and their actions in that regime where they're flooded with this stuff. Some people go through some sort of stress inoculation event in their life where they'll do something very, very hard. They'll embrace a marathon or a major exam. I mean, look, I've got a good friend who's a neurosurgeon and it's one of the hardest fields in medicine. And there's a lot of adrenaline at first, but a lot of the training is learning how to stay calm when things go wrong because millimeters matter. And it's a successive process of stress inoculation. And when we say stress inoculation, we're not talking about no adrenaline released. We're talking about learning how to stay calm, even though there's adrenaline released. And those are two very different things. I've been talking about this a little bit recently on Instagram, but the whole motivation for doing high intensity breathing or for ice baths is to put one's body and mind into a state of stress and then to find the ability to calm oneself inside of that. And it's not to eliminate the stress, it's to calm the mind while the body is agitated so that you're in control. And I think that we've overemphasized the need to limit stress. I think most kids, frankly, would benefit from learning a stress inoculation practice, from increasing their threshold for stress. For me, that came through skateboarding, martial arts, and unfortunately some hard events that threw me into stress. For other people, comes from something else. But I think that we can enhance our capacity to cope with stress because these neural circuits that allow us to maintain clarity of mind when we're flooded with adrenaline, those circuits can be modified by experience. If you learn how to do that a few times, then when real life stress hits and kind of smacks you square in the face, you learn how to open up your gaze, realize where you are in time and in space, think for a second or more about what you're going to do and react adaptively. So you don't do stupid things that get you into trouble or that injure other people or yourself or get you thrown in jail or worse, dead. So, or using again. So, in the addiction community, there's I think a deep understanding now that the trauma and the backstory is important. But if you want to help somebody stay clean, get clean and stay clean, you need that person to understand how to control their actions when they are very agitated. And the opposite is true too. A lot of people don't talk about this, but a lot of relapse in the addiction community is when people are feeling really good, right? They were doing so well and then they crash. And that makes sense too, based on our earlier discussion about dopamine, because remember, when you're feeling really good, the temptation is going to be to go find more things that make you feel good. And so it makes perfect sense to me why you hear that somebody's doing really well in life and everything's going great and all of a sudden they relapse. Well, that's because this molecule dopamine is generic. It doesn't know the difference between cocaine and a job promotion. So the person gets the job promotion, they've been clean for 4 years, and they're like, you know what, I'm doing great. I'm just going to go do one line of cocaine. And all of a sudden they're back where they were. And it's like, well, the bridge from one to the other was dopamine. Makes perfect sense. So I think that's why, in the addiction community, there are all these beautiful sayings, but they say, we have to be careful of our high states and our low states. You're always trying to modulate where you're at on that spectrum so that you neither lose track of where you've been, nor do you lose track of where you're going. And what's interesting about AA and the NA language, for the book I'm working on, I spend a lot of time in the addiction community learning from people, is there's all this beautiful language in the NA and AA literature, like things that people can remember to keep them on track. It's not just the meetings, although the meetings are vital. It's not just the community, although the community is vital. It's these sayings. And when I look at those sayings, every time I see one, I see neuroscience. I see an element of neuroscience. So those people that developed those sayings, they didn't know about brain function, but I think they had an unconscious genius and they were able to pull out some very core principles of neuroscience. And those core principles are embedded in, for instance, the, whatever they call it, the 12-step book or the big book. Forgive me, because I was tangential to that community just as an observer. So I don't have the names exactly right.
The last thing I want to ask you is about the stress response and fight or flight. And what are some ways that when people get into this state where they're heightened, they're anxious, they're on edge, they feel threatened, what they can do to lower that stress response in a short amount of time so that they're able to kind of get back into a state of calmness?
Yeah, having tools at your disposal to quickly adjust your stress is so key. And the ones that I'm most in favor of are what I call real-time tools that were designed to calm you. And the tools that I'm aware of that work fastest are going to be respiration, aka breathing, and vision. So let's talk about the respiration tools. There's so much out there now about breath work and meditation and all this stuff. But for most people, for the typical person off the street, my sister, my neighbor, they're not doing daily breath work. What they need is something that when they're feeling anxious, they can calm themselves quickly. And so there's a very straightforward neural circuit. So a collection of neurons in the brain that control the diaphragm, which is this muscle in our bodies that moves our lungs. And there's a pattern of breathing that are called physiological sighs, which involves inhaling twice through the nose and then exhaling once through the mouth. And that pattern of breathing has the ability to completely inflate these little sacs in our lungs, which become deflated when we're stressed. And what's cool about it is when you do that double inhale, it fills those sacs. And then when you exhale, it pulls carbon dioxide out of the bloodstream and pushes it out of your system. So carbon dioxide is part of the reason why we feel stress. So this double inhale, so double inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth, that done 1 or 3 times is the fastest way that I'm aware of to calm down when you're feeling stressed. You don't have to make any noise doing that. I'm just doing that because there's a microphone here so that people can understand. Now, if you can't breathe through your nose, you can do it through your mouth, although it's better to do both inhales through the nose and the exhale through the mouth. Now, how often can you do this? Anytime you feel stressed. So you're going to inhale, big deep inhale, and then sneak in a little bit more air and then exhale, nice long exhale. Most people find that just one, maybe two of those or three of those will calm them down really quickly. Be aware, however, that your heartbeat is going to be the last thing to come down, and you want that to be a slow process. You don't want your heartbeat to quickly slow down. So these physiological sighs have been shown to occur during sleep, during claustrophobia, as a way for animals and people to regulate their levels of excitation and kind of arousal, aka stress. And it's a tool that's embedded in all of us. There's no learning. I mean, I had to tell it to you for you to learn it, to know it, but there's no learning involved, meaning there's no neuroplasticity involved. But that said, if people do this repeatedly throughout the day, or they do this when they feel stressed, pretty soon they get a very rapid reduction in stress by just doing it once. And that's because the circuits get more powerful. They get stronger as you do them. The vision tools for relieving stress are powerful too, because they're completely covert also. No one has to know you're doing them. So the one that I like the most involves dilating your gaze. So this means not moving your head or eyes. So it's not looking around the room. It's just whatever you're looking at, whether or not it's a computer or your phone or you're in conversation with somebody, it's just, or you're just sitting there not looking at much of anything at all. You just start dilating your gaze so you can see as much of the room or the space that you're in as possible. And then you start to see your body in the space that you're in. And what this does is it releases a brainstem mechanism, like deep in the brain, that's involved in vigilance and attention. And when you do that, you very quickly experience a relaxation response. And you can combine these things. You can do the double inhale, exhale, and then dilate your gaze. And what you'll find is that stress is reduced very, very fast. Now, there's one other tool for stress that I think is really exciting, which is the ability to raise your threshold for stress. And to do that, typically you want to push yourself into a stressful mode. A couple ways you can do that. You can take a cold shower, you can take an ice bath, but the way that I think is most interesting and powerful is, and doesn't involve the need for equipment or anything like that, is to do 25 or 30 really quick, deep breaths. So it's going to be inhale deep, exhale, inhale deep, exhale. And what you'll find is by the 25th or so, you'll feel stressed. You'll feel agitated, and it doesn't feel good. But then if you exhale your air and you sit calmly for maybe 10, 15 seconds, you'll realize that you can be completely calm even though you've got all that adrenaline in your system, because you didn't get rid of the adrenaline. You repeat that 2 or 3 times, and what you'll find is, in general, stressful events in life don't have so much of an impact on you anymore. So it's a really different way to approach stress relief. It's really about throwing yourself into stress and learning how to tolerate stress. The size and the panoramic vision, the dilating your gaze, those are more about pushing back on stress when it happens in real time. And I should just mention about the rapid breathing. A lot of people don't like it. It's not for everybody, nor are ice baths for everybody for that matter. Don't do it anywhere near water, because it is possible to get dizzy and pass out. Don't do it while driving. Don't do it while bicycling. Do it seated or standing. And that first round, people do feel agitated. And, of course, if you have a heart condition or something, talk to your doctor. But, with all the appropriate caveats in mind, breathing is a path to feeling certain ways, stressed or unstressed. And once you start to realize that you can use respiration as a way to steer those paths, then you also develop an additional level of understanding, control over your nervous system, so that when troubling things arrive, you recognize, I am in an altered state. And then you start looking to things like your breathing and your vision to control that state. And you start to realize that you have a lot more control over your internal landscape and your nervous system than perhaps you initially might have thought.
So I hope you got a ton out of that section with myself and Dr. Andrew Huberman. And in this next part, you will hear a section from a previously released episode with Dr. Jud Brewer. Dr. Jud is a renowned addiction psychiatrist and neuroscientist whose TED Talk, A Simple Way to Break a Bad Habit, has over 16 million views on YouTube. Dr. Jud shares in depth about what anxiety actually is and how it can be directly related to your habits. You will also discover science-based actionable steps that you can immediately take to understand, manage, and mitigate anxiety. You will also learn some common anxiety myths and the important role that things like awareness, mindfulness, and curiosity play into all of this, and so much more. So I hope you enjoy this next part with me and Dr. Jud Brewer.
You went deeper on the subject of really trying to heal anxiety from a proactive approach and getting deep into it, because I've heard you say that there's several 100 million people, I think, in the US or so to speak, that will struggle with anxiety or struggle. Like 1 in 3, I think, will have some sort of anxiety disorder when it's all said and done.
Yeah.
And then I've also heard you say that as a traditional psychiatrist, like the rate of success is like 1 in 5 when you're just giving somebody a pill.
Yeah.
So talk a bit about like, what was the moment like where were you when you decided I'm going to change gears a little bit. I'm going to shift. I'm going to stop prescribing medicine. I'm going to stop solely prescribing medication, and I'm going to look for other solutions to try to have a better track record with my patients.
Yeah, well, this came serendipitously out of two things. One is it's like a pain point, right? Anytime somebody's having pain, then they're more likely to buy a pain reliever.
Right.
So my pain point was my own anxiety with being able to help my patients, right? It was basically playing the medication lottery where 1 in 5 of them would benefit from the best medications out there. And that came along. My lab was studying habit change and how to really affect habit change in a major way, which started with alcohol and cocaine use disorders and helping people there, and then moved on to smoking and had this clinical study I was working at Yale at the time, a clinical study out of my lab where we got 5 times the quit rates of gold standard treatment for smoking. And that really was eye-popping for me, where I was thinking, wow, this could actually work. We were studying mindfulness. And then we did another study where we delivered mindfulness through an app to help people with overeating. And we got a 40% reduction in craving related eating. And that was also, I was thinking, wow. But there, this person, one of the people in our program, this Eat Right Now app, said, hey, I'm noticing that anxiety is triggering me to eat. Can you create a program for anxiety? And I was thinking, well, I prescribe medication for anxiety. But as a researcher, I said, it kind of put a pea under my mattress, and I just couldn't, I kept rolling that over in my mind. And I was thinking, well, let me go look at the literature and see. And this is where this overlooked literature from the 1980s, this is back when, Prozac was first being, rolled out on the market. So folks were focusing there. It suggested that anxiety could be driven in the same way as other habits. And so I started thinking, oh, habits, I know how to work with those. Can we actually apply this to anxiety? So we actually created an app called Unwinding Anxiety to test it because I wanted to see if it actually worked. And we got gangbuster results. We've now done 3 clinical trials. And the first one was with anxious physicians. We got a 57% reduction in clinically validated anxiety scores. We did the next one with people with generalized anxiety disorder. We got a 67% reduction. And here we could calculate that number. So you mentioned this 20% hit rate. So that it's called the number needed to treat, how many people you need to treat before one person shows a significant reduction in symptoms. So for medications, that's 5.15. In this study, it was 1.6, meaning we had to treat many fewer people before one person showed significant reduction.
I think a lot of people, they misunderstand the word anxiety because anxiety gets intertwined a lot with fear, gets intertwined a lot with worry, gets intertwined a lot with uncertainty. But I think from what I understand, worry is much different than anxiety, and anxiety is much different than fear. So if you could give like your definition of anxiety and how it differentiates from the other words, I think people will get a lot out of that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. If you think of anxiety, I think the standard definition goes something like this feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease about something with an uncertain outcome. So here, if we zoom in on the word worry, like you're pointing out, worry can be a feeling where I'm feeling nervous, I'm feeling worried. And it can also be a verb. I'm worrying. So I worry about something. And like you're saying, those can be separated because a feeling is different than an action. And here it's really helpful to see them in both of their manifestations, because for any habit, we need three elements: a trigger, a behavior, and a result. And so if you think of the feeling of worry triggering the mental behavior of worrying, that result is, like you'd said earlier, it makes us feel like we're in control. Yet when we realize that we aren't, it just feeds back and then makes us more worried, which then makes us worry more, which then makes us more worried.
Yeah.
And then, we go over that event horizon into the black hole of anxiety.
Yeah. And it's interesting to kind of map. I know you talk a lot about mapping out behavior, mapping out habit loops and stuff like that. But I think it's interesting when you map out like where your initial thought was, and then when you get anxious or worried, like where it goes, it gets so completely like unrealistic and irrelevant to what you're actually dealing with, that I think when you write things down, which I know you talk about in your book, you're able to gain some sense of clarity, because you're like, oh, like that's not realistic. Like I don't understand why I should be worrying about this. And you kind of are able to bring yourself back to reality through being mindful. So I know within the realm of anxiety, there's different forms that I think people would appreciate knowing. I know that there's like just the immediate sense of anxiety that might come if say you and I were to get into an argument right now. I might get anxious, I might get tense, I might get these feelings, these sensations. Then there's the people that I think just have anxiety on a regular basis that's built up through the years, and they've just gotten used to that through their habits and behaviors and through biological sort of thing. And then there's also like the intense panic attack that comes where you feel like you're dying, you feel like you just need to escape and push away whatever you're doing right now. So what are the different types of anxieties? And then like, which ones do you think are more common these days?
Well, I would say the most common one, I would just call this everyday anxiety.
Yeah.
Where we might get anxious about something uncertain. We start thinking about it. Our brain starts to freak out a little bit and we get anxious. I'm guessing we've all experienced that over the last year, probably more than ever. I think the numbers that I quoted in my book were something like 250% increase in psychological distress just in the last year, like huge spikes in anxiety. So that's something that we all experience. When this becomes pervasive, for example, generalized anxiety disorder is characterized by this pervasive anxiety. A lot of my patients, they wake up in the morning and the first thing they notice is that they feel anxious. And then they start getting anxious about why they're feeling anxious. And it just drives the thing through the whole day. And they wake up this day, and often I've had people say, I can't remember the last time I wasn't anxious, because it's just kind of who they are. Even there was somebody that wrote me an email who is an early pilot tester of our Unrunning Anxiety app. And she said, I feel like anxiety is deeply etched in my bones. Wow. Right? That's how identified she was with her anxiety. So that's kind of the anxiety spectrum. With panic, I think the definition is something like wildly unthinking behavior that is driven by anxiety. So here we can wake up and have, like, I used to get panic attacks. I'd wake up in the middle of the night. So I don't know what it was. I mean, I was in residency training, so I'm sure there was plenty of anxiety there, but we can have a panic attack just come out of the blue. Or we can panic where we're kind of anxiety is building and building, and suddenly our brain is so offline that we are panicking.
Have you seen any correlation with lifestyle and people's levels of anxiety?
Yeah, well, and I think it's what you're describing is really important. Here, for example, our brains they're kind of set up for survival. And that survival mechanism basically says, if there's something unpleasant, make it go away as quickly as possible. Okay. So if we do that, we can set those up pretty quickly as habits. So for example, I feel bad, so I'm going to eat some ice cream, right? And feel better, or some chocolate or whatever. Or I feel bad, I'm going to go on social media so I can distract myself. Or we do all of these things. So that totally gets in the way of these lifestyle things that you're talking about, where we eat ice cream and then we're not hungry for a healthy meal, or we are on social media all day and so we don't have time to exercise at nighttime or something like that. Or we stay up late and we don't actually get to sleep. One thing I've seen a lot of is people checking news late at night. Well, surprise, it's going to be hard to sleep because it's generally not good news. They're pointing out all the things that we're struggling with as a world population. So here, I think there are two elements. One is that people get stuck in these habits. What was it called? The quarantine 15, that they had to upgrade to the 20 and then the 30 because people were gaining so much weight. And they're like, oh, I'll lose it after the quarantine and I'll lose it after the pandemic. Now this pandemic has gone on over a year. Well, so they do those things and then they have to try to catch up. But at the same time, they're not setting the stage where these preventive measures, these lifestyle measures, could be helping them not get caught in these habits. But it's their brain going for a quick fix and not realizing that quick fix is actually not a fix at all.
Yeah, I think it's this cycle where you take it, you use a short-term solution to deal with a long-term problem. Mm-hmm. And I think the big problem today is that there's a lot of rhetoric in society that you deserve it. You've had a bad day, so you can have a bottle of wine. You've had a bad day, so you can eat that tub of ice cream. You've had that bad day, so you can go out and just spend a bunch of money. But in reality, that makes things worse, because what happens when you drink a bottle of wine? Like, how do you really feel? You get up the next day and you're like, why did I do that? Now I feel worse. So could you talk about the difference? Because I know you talk about in your book, you talk about being kind to yourself and loving yourself and treating yourself in a certain way so that you feel more open, you feel more confident in being able to grow. And the difference between that and kind of self-indulgence to the point where some of these choices make you feel even worse.
Yes. Well, saying, oh, you've had a bad day. Why don't you go get a hammer and then put your hand on the table and beat your hand with the hammer, right? That's not taking care of ourselves. So this isn't to say that chocolate isn't good or having a glass of wine for most people isn't fine, right? But this is about when we do anything to excess, because our brains are looking for those quick fixes. So the only way to really step out of these, because we get caught in these habits, right? I write about, in the Unwinding Anxiety book, I write about a patient who was referred to me for alcohol use disorder. And he was using alcohol to medicate his anxiety, where he was anxious, he would drink, and he never made that connection that it was his anxiety that was driving him to drink. He just ended up drinking a whole lot every day. And then he was getting more anxious because he was getting behind in work and all of this stuff. So the piece here is our brains have to be able to first see how unrewarding the current behavior is. And it's not just, oh, I'm going to magically make ice cream not taste good. No, it doesn't work that way. I'm going to magically not make, mindfulness is going to wave its magic wand and suddenly I won't like chocolate anymore. No, I actually like chocolate more when I pay attention to it than when I don't, when I'm eating it mindlessly. But this is about finding these pleasure plateaus where our brains are going to naturally, if I eat chocolate, I can start to notice, when is it enough? And it's surprising how little is enough, right? And so if I want a little pick-me-up, I can eat 1 or 2 squares of dark chocolate and really, it's good. I'm done. And I can also notice what happens when I just keep eating a bunch of chocolate if I'm stressed or bored. It doesn't fix the problem. And then I just get a stomach ache or I gain weight or whatever, all those things. So here it's about bringing awareness in and helping us see, oh, what do I actually need right now? Am I meeting those needs? And if I want something to, as a pick-me-up or just as something that celebrate it, because it's not self-care when we're overindulging, it's how little is enough there. And we're always going to find that pleasure plateau. So I think of this, and I write about this in the book, as finding those bigger, better offers. And the bigger, better offer can be being kind to ourselves when we need that kindness as compared to indulging in something. That bigger, better offer could be as simple as not overeating chocolate as compared to just having a few squares of chocolate, for example.
So I want to go back to something you said a moment ago where you had a guy who was struggling with alcohol, like an alcohol addiction problem. I know you don't like the word disorder. I'm not a fan of it either. But do you think that anxiety and depression is at the root of a lot of addiction issues that we're seeing now? I mean, I know there's a lot of rhetoric around trauma. There's a lot of rhetoric around just the brain in general. Like, do you think that if people could really learn how to deal with their anxiety and their depression in a way that's healthy and that's sustainable, that the addictions would subside?
Well, I would say they drive addiction a lot. So I have an addiction clinic, and the majority, if not almost all of my patients have comorbid anxiety of some sort and or depression. So those tend to hang out together quite a bit. And so I think if people could learn to work with their anxiety, that would certainly help quite a bit with addictions. Not every single person, but I would say quite a number of people.
Yeah. I mean, because I know from my own experience is that my anxiety habit loop would be get anxious, snort Oxycontin, feel good in the moment, but then feel like crap later. That was like my habit loop. And it just started, that's how I wired my brain, was like, in order to feel good when you're anxious, you have to do a drug. And that just became my new normal. And then when I went to jail, I realized, well, I didn't have access to the drugs anymore. So I had to figure out, okay, like the anxiety is still there. Mm-hmm. The fear is still there. The depression is still there. So how do you deal with it? And thankfully, my cellmate encouraged me to start exercising. And I started to develop these new habit loops. Feel anxious, exercise, feel better about myself long term. And it just ingrained these new habits in my mind. And then over time, I started to say, okay, like when I have the confidence now, when I'm feeling emotional or I'm feeling anxious, to choose something that might not make me feel satisfied right away. But afterwards, I'm like, wow, I'm so thankful that I dealt with it in a healthy way. And I know you talk about this in your book. I think you had a patient that was struggling with going into the store and eating unhealthy food. She opted for the fruit instead and felt so much better, not just because she didn't have that gut bomb from the unhealthy foods, but because she made a choice that she knew she should have made that was in line with the person that she wanted to become. And I definitely, I think now wanted to go into, like, what do you think causes anxiety in itself? Is it genetics? Is it lifestyle choice? I know we talked about that a little bit. Is it just bad behaviors over time? Like in your clinic, what have you seen is the number one cause of people that struggle with chronic anxiety?
Yeah, it's hard to disentangle all those elements. I think all of them are important. Mm-hmm. But one thing that I like to think about is genetics, for example. For some people, they win the genetic lottery, so they're just chill all the time, no matter what. I'm sure we've all met those people. And then there's the rest of us. But nobody has control over their genes. So whether it's genetic or not, I actually kind of place that off to the side because that's not something I can help somebody with. Right. Down the road, we might have more genetically based medications, but that's years and years down the road. Right now, in my clinic, I've got somebody that's anxious. They might be genetically predisposed or whatnot. I have no control over that, nor do they. But what everybody has some say in is how they relate to their own minds. So if I can train my patients to be able to see how their minds work and all the contributions they're making to feeding that anxiety, that's a place where they can make real progress.
I know you also talk about some myths, I guess, in the book, in what people are told that they can do to solve anxiety, which in the long run doesn't work. So what do you think are the few of the things that people or have been told consistently on how to deal with their anxiety that just isn't true?
Yes. So one, and I think this is just a Western mindset that it tries to approach everything this way as well. So, and anxiety also falls under this same category, which is the just do it mindset, right? Just stop it. So, oh, you're worried, just stop worrying, just relax. It'd be great if we could just tell ourselves to relax and then we could relax. It's almost like we were, I don't know if you ever had this as a kid, but the kid's anxious and then the parent says, hey, will you just relax? And then the kid gets more anxious. Yeah. So that's one of and this is not just anxiety. We're seeing this with any habit. Just stop it. Doesn't work. So that's one. The other is avoidance. So we've seen this with some lifestyle modifications where somebody says, well, I want to avoid eating crappy food, so I'm not going to have it in the house. How does that work for anxiety? Are we going to have an anxiety-free zone in the house where it's like, oh, can't go in there when I'm anxious? So that doesn't work either, as much as it may work for some people for other habits. And I use those caveats there because research has shown that basically the people that do that are already good at setting habits. So it's easier for them to not buy ice cream at the grocery store. When the rest of us are out there and we're stressed and we make this quick run to the grocery store and there's ice cream in the freezer.
I want to now get into your approach to getting through these habit loops and rewiring your brain so it's better suited to manage anxiety. Mm-hmm. So let's talk about it. Say I'm a patient and I'm coming to you and I'm just saying, hey, Dr. Jud, I'm really struggling with anxiety every day. I can't seem to stop worrying. I don't know what's wrong with me. I feel like crap every day. I'm not sleeping. How are you going to help me unpack what I have going on?
The first thing I would do is, and I used to do this, I'd pull out a blank piece of paper in my clinic with my patients, and I just write trigger, behavior, result down. We've actually made a free PDF. I think it's just mapmyhabit.com. Anybody can download this. So that's what I would do is I would print out that worksheet and hand it to them. And I would say, okay, what are your triggers? What's the behavior? Is it worry? Is it avoidance? What's that behavior? And then what's the result of that? So if we even just walk through that, if we were filling out that questionnaire together, how would you fill that out?
I guess trigger would be maybe say a client cancels on me for my training business.
Yeah.
Then the behavior would be like worry about how I'm going to make money. Mm-hmm. And then the reward would be, I would feel even more anxious because now I've taken more time out of my day where I could have been spent being proactive about solving the problem and worrying about something I couldn't control. And that just becomes this toxic cycle. And then I end up becoming tired because my brain has just used up a lot of this cognitive and emotional energy worrying about something I can't control. And it just goes down this crazy rabbit hole.
Yeah. So you're pointing out some beautiful mapping, and you're also pointing out how it feeds back. That result feeds back and triggers more anxiety, and so that it becomes the loop. So that's really the first step. The second step that I would take with you is then I would send you home from my office and I would say, map out these habit loops and focus in on what you're actually getting from the behavior. You already described it, but so you talked about wasting energy and time. This isn't actually solving the problem, right? Because worrying about getting more clients is different than you being calm, being creative and saying, okay, patient canceled or client canceled. Oh, what can I do to whatever, solve that problem, whatever the problem is. So here, this is the second step that I talk about in the book, is about helping to tap into this reward-based learning system in our brain. The only way to change a behavior, for example, worrying, is to see how unrewarding it is, right? And so I'd have people really focus in on what are you getting from the worrying and asking that question, what am I getting from this, right? Not just intellectually, but also directly experientially. So they would see, oh, it's not solving the problem and it's making my anxiety worse, just using your hypothetical as an example.
Right.
So from there, the nice thing is you were talking about what's actionable, right? Well, the action comes from our brain getting disenchanted with the old behavior. We can't kind of force something else in, wedge the door open if the closet's full. We have to pull out that gunk out and clean out the closet. The nice thing is our brain will naturally clean the closet through us seeing how unhelpful that stuff is that's in the closet already. So if we're like, oh, this is junk, why do I have it in here? We'll naturally pull it out. That's what our brain does. We did a study with eating, for example, with this Eat Right Now app. And we found that helping people pay attention as they were overeating, within 10 times of people doing that, they cleaned out that mental closet. And that reward value dropped so far down that they actually stopped overeating. And we could watch that behavior change from overeating to not overeating simply by having them really pay attention as they were doing that. So that's that cleaning out of the mental closet that comes with step 2, which then opens up the door for us to put new stuff in the closet that's actually helpful. It's like, oh, new sports equipment, when realized that the ab machine or whatever we had in there wasn't actually helping us get good abs. Oh, I need to see a trainer instead of buy an ab machine. So that's what I call the bigger, better offer.
Yeah. But do you think though that a lot of the success rate is so good with that because a lot of people have this sense of self-awareness that they maybe haven't had before? Because I think a lot of people are just on autopilot and something happens, they make a choice based on their current level of consciousness, and then they go on, they move on, and then something happens, they make a choice, and they 3, 4, 5 years go by and you're like, man, like, how did I gain all this weight? Or how did I develop this massive addiction? Or how come I am chronically worrying every day? But I think when you give people the ability to become self-aware, they become empowered because like, oh, like now I can see what's going on. Let me take some action that's going to move me closer to who I want to become. And so I know that the first gear is mapping out the habit. Second gear is really getting deep and attaching emotion and feeling to the reward and really getting clear on what the reward is actually doing for you in your life.
Yeah.
And then I believe the third gear is the bigger, better offer, which was where mindfulness comes in. But before we talk about mindfulness, I thought that something was really interesting in your book is you talked about the science of mindfulness and getting curious and what that actually does to the brain. I think there's some correlation, or it triggers the same part of the brain, I think, is when you get a craving or an intense craving that you harp on. So if you could talk about that for a second before we get into third gear, I think people would really get a lot out of this, the science of this, so that they can then understand why it's so important for them to enact in this behavior.
Yeah. So there's a fair amount of research showing that there's a part of the network of brain regions called the default mode network that gets activated when people are anxious, and it also gets activated when they're craving everything from gambling to cigarettes to cocaine to chocolate. Okay. So that network gets really activated. And what my lab did was we first studied this. We weren't looking for the default mode network, but we were looking across the entire brain at what was different between people who meditate a bunch versus those that don't. And we found that the default mode network was really quiet during meditation. And then it even rewired where it was talking differentially to different brain regions than people who don't. And I think that has a lot to do with what you're talking about, being on autopilot versus not. So we found this about 10 years ago with experienced meditators. And then we started studying this to see if we could actually change this default mode brain network activity. So for example, we did a study where we randomized people who were trying to quit smoking. We randomized them to get our Craving to Quit app versus the National Cancer Institute's app. But at baseline, we scanned their brains when we showed them smoking cues to watch their default mode network get really active. Then at the end of the study, we could scan their brains again and see how much the decrease in default mode network activity correlated with decreases in cigarettes. We found a really strong correlation with the mindfulness training, no correlation with the National Cancer Institute's app. So here we could see, this network is important in getting caught up in experience, whether it's anxiety or addiction or whatever. And here we could specifically target it basically with simple awareness practices with training.
That's awesome. And I think I've heard you talk about how during like fight or flight or when we're incredibly stressed or anxious, like the prefrontal cortex kind of shuts off.
Yeah, it goes offline.
Right. So we lose a lot of our ability to think cognitively when we're in those moments. So that's where the importance of kind of practice. You hear a lot, just practice the pause, but you don't understand the importance of it.
Yeah.
And what I found, and I'll let you articulate this a bit more, is that when I practiced getting curious, or this mindfulness approach that you allude to in your book, it reduces the half-life of the anxiety, and then you can kind of just ride the wave, and then you can kind of move on. And then I think the other thing that happens, which I think you talk a lot about too, is the importance of the role of identity when it comes to anxiety. And it's just, you're able to observe and say, I'm feeling anxious or I'm experiencing anxious feelings instead of I'm anxious. And I think there's a massive difference in the two with the mind. So, but I want to kind of pivot it back to you. So if you will, could you articulate in depth, like what the third gear is, why it's so important? And then as you're talking about curiosity, talk about like why it's more, curiosity is not just so general. Like you can be curious and say, I want to see if drinking a shot of vodka will help me in this moment. It's more about going within and looking internal versus external.
Yes. So the one liner on this BBO, this third gear or third step, is that if our brains are disenchanted with the old behavior, it opens up that space, right? It opens up the closet space to have put in something that's more helpful. And our brains are going to naturally pick a behavior that's more rewarding. So my lab has done research looking to see at all bunch of different mental states, which ones are more rewarding. Well, it might sound like a no-brainer, but curiosity is more rewarding than anxiety. Being kind to ourselves is more rewarding than being mean to ourselves, okay? So once we see this hierarchy that is naturally established in our brains, it's not something we have to tell ourselves to do or to learn. It's already set up. What we can then do is help our brain see very clearly that connection. So not only can we help ourselves see that worrying isn't helpful, that's that second step, but we can start to get curious about what worry feels like in the moment. And already we're shifting to the third step because we're shifting more into curiosity rather than being stuck in worry. Worry tends to close us down, make us feel contracted, whereas curiosity opens us up And you can't be closed and open at the same time. They're binary opposites. So if you're bringing in something that is more rewarding, that is opening, we can actually open in that moment rather than being stuck in that tight little ball of anxiety.
Why do you think it's so important for people to unwind anxiety instead of just trying to instantly like untangle a knot within a few seconds?
That's a great question. So if we instantly try to untangle a knot, we are invariably going to pull it tighter. And what we have to do really is be able to look at that knot and see where the ends are and see where the tightness is, so to speak. And that can take more than a second. So we've got to look beyond the instant gratification of, oh, I'm going to pull on this knot, and help us see, oops, I pulled on it. It's now tighter, right? These are all of our unhelpful compensatory habit loops on top of the anxiety. And then we have to be able to see, oh, if I step back and I look at this knot carefully, if I understand it, right? The analogy is understanding how our minds work. That's when we can untangle the knot. That's when we can work with our minds.
So hopefully you got a lot out of this episode on mastering your response to stress and anxiety, and learned a ton from Dr. Andrew Huberman, Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett, and Dr. Jud Brewer. And so what I like to ask is, just like I do with most of the other episodes, is that you take a screenshot and you share a takeaway. Maybe it was something that Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett said, or something that Dr. Andrew Huberman said, or something that Dr. Jud Brewer said. Whatever it was, whatever the takeaway was, tag myself and tag them. I will include their social media handles in the show notes, as well as the links to the previously recorded episodes that were featured in this episode. And so we once again thank you for listening to this episode of The Adversity Advantage. I'm your host, Doug Bopst, and we'll see you next time.